Hello and welcome to another Please Do PlayStation All-Stars, When's PlayStation All-Stars, and finally, do a video on PlayStation All-Stars, you motherfucking sucker. Well, thanks to all of you who suggested it, with the biggest thanks going to Big Boss Jared Chocolat down at the Flophouse VIP Patreon, who made sure that I can no longer keep avoiding this day. Truth be told, I always assumed the story of PS All-Stars Battle Royale featuring Dante from the Devil May Cry series wasn't a particularly interesting one. It came out, some people didn't like it, and it went away. But no, it goes far deeper than that, and I can think pretty deep. The genesis of the project all the way to its post-release support was filled with dizzying highs, terrifying lows, and those oh-so-famously creamy middles. And while plenty of info has surfaced about PS All-Stars since its release, I myself was able to speak to a developer who worked on it to shed some additional light onto something that seemed like it was going to be such a surefire hit, but for a multitude of reasons, still kinda was. We began with a little-known indie developer called Naughty Dog, who were still very much in the thick of developing some game called The Last of Us for Sony Computer Entertainment when another project started gestating from within the company. While Sony had published games from across the entire spectrum of genres over 3 generations of hardware, the one thing they hadn't yet touched was the concept of the crossover, bringing together multiple characters and franchises in a star-studded affair. The original idea was to have these Naughty Dogs start fleshing out what this crossover could be, since they already happened to be responsible for a number of Sony's aforementioned biggest stars. However, they simply couldn't afford giving up any manpower for an extra game. In fact, Sony didn't really have any prospective studios who were free at the time, so it was decided that a new internal team would need to be formed. Initially comprised of just a few employees from Sony Santa Monica, the studio was dubbed No, not quite yet. It was in fact first named Broodworks, and once they expanded their numbers, they then changed their name to Superbot. Not entirely sure why. Pre-production began sometime in 2009, and things started off quite differently than how they ended up, which we'll be getting to. To keep the game's dream match nature under wraps, it was given the incredibly generic moniker of Title Fight, which is a name that promises a combative contest, even if that wasn't strictly the case. In an attempt to not copy Smash Brothers before, they decided to copy Smash Brothers later on, Title Fight's origins actually started as a competitive platformer. It featured arenas that were much more horizontal and larger overall than what was seen in the final game, and while combat was going to be a component, the game revolved around completing objectives like capture the flag or moving a ball past a goal to score points. The fact that Kratos could still violently beat a rapping puppy was just kind of a thing that sorta happened. For 2009 and most of 2010, this was the game's focus, and while it had similarities to Nintendo's franchise, it was definitely skewing towards being more of a party game and less of a fighter. This was a bit of a tumultuous time for Title Fight, as trying to have both combat and minigame style objectives left it feeling a little unfocused. It was eventually decided to just settle on one style, and so the kibosh was put on the objectives. With this newfound direction and a full green light from Sony, they ramped up the hiring process, putting out the call for more experienced designers. One of these new hires was Omar Kendall, who had previously worked at Paradox Entertainment on Backyard Wrestling, MK Shaolin Monks, and X-Men Next Dimension, before leaving his position as a designer on THQ's UFC Undisputed 3 to join Superbot. With such a strong fighting acumen, he was then placed in the role of director, since that was the path the game was now taking. Now, it's not great that the game spent almost 2 years being something else entirely, and you'd think that the renewed focus would be the end of the troubles, but that sadly wasn't the case. From here on out, there was a cavalcade of small mistakes and slip-ups that were both in and not in Superbot's control. When they let the world know that they were hiring, it also put various gaming websites and Sony fans on high alert, because Superbot has specifically asked for people experienced in combat-heavy games and online multiplayer, which clued people in a little on what they were making. What clued them in way more was that Superbot also proudly and loudly declared that they were a Sony studio, and that was enough for them to be put under a massive magnifying glass. That's also when the leak started, and when they never really stopped. Images of Twisted Metal's Sweet Tooth and a bit of text confirming Kratos then popped up online, and the gaming community exploded. It was crystal that Super Sony Brothers was coming, but as with most marketing plans, everyone just kind of buried their head in the sand about it, and these images leaked a good 4 months before the official reveal. The universe, not being content with screwing the project over a little bit, decided to screw it way more. Someone who had participated in a private focus test for All-Stars just said, "Yeah, fuck it," and spoke publicly online about what they played, confirming the full starting roster of fighters, stages, and other aspects of the game, which was again way before its big reveal. Now, while a good number of fans took this news with a grain of salt, among the hardcore, it certainly did lessen the impact when PSASBR was officially announced on an episode of GTTV, which, oh god, ooh, that's a nostalgia blast, woo. Oh, okay, I'm alright. Anyway, the starting lineup of fighters were shown, with some you'd expect and some you wouldn't, and I think it's fair to say that the reaction was positive. No one was really surprised, but Sony fans were excited, and Smash fans stuck their noses high up in the air, as they are wont to do. Now, you know those leaks that never stopped leaking? Well, they never stopped leaking. The game's entire roster then had its balls exposed on stream, with every single character, as well as a ton of other information, being mined from the various private and public betas Superbot had conducted that summer and early fall. This even included the third-party characters, so when they finally announced the likes of Raiden, Dante, and Big Daddy, the cat was already long out of the bag. That July, a Vita version was then announced, with it being pretty much an exact one-to-one port of its console brother, and developed by Bluepoint Games. It featured excellent crossplay in an era where crossplay was rare, especially on this scale, and it was all possible due to it running on Bluepoint's own engine. This at least provided a very hassle-free working environment for Superbot, because unlike many episodes of What Happened, there were very few technical or engine-related issues that needed to be struggled through. Also around this time, Seth Killian, former Capcom Unity megaboss and fighting game magnate, officially joined Sony Santa Monica, who were assisting Superbot with the workload on All-Stars. With his tenure at Capcom well known, it was evident that Sony was trying to push the game squarely into the fighting game space, certainly more than the last Smash game had been, which was a smart move. What wasn't a smart move, though, was one of All-Star's core gameplay systems, which was all about building up super moves, the only way to get KOs. What happened here is that it really didn't matter how good you were for the vast majority of the match, your moment-to-moment decisions. You just needed to collect as much AP orbs as possible, which fueled your super, and then to just fire it off. This left the core combat experience feeling very one-dimensional to a lot of people, and in an interview conducted well after All-Star's release, Omar Kendall stated that he felt this system was a mistake, and that if given the chance to do it all over again, he would do it all over again. So, when these PlayStation All-Stars finally battled their way onto the PS3 and Vita after a short month-long delay from October to late November, reviews were excitedly and enthusiastically mixed, with many outlets citing the super system, the lack of meaty offline content, and the disappointing roster as the negatives. Praise was given, however, to the inventive and exciting transforming stages, slick graphics, the fast and satisfying combat feel, and the solid online experience. But now is where we're going to need to touch upon that roster, because because, man, that was a whole separate thing, and maybe even the key reason why I'm talking to you about this game right now. While some inclusions like Kratos, Sly, or Sir Daniel Fortescue were expected and very much welcome, there were almost as many other characters and lack of other characters that left fans scratching their heads until they were raw and bloody. Starting first with the fighters that did make the big Sony shindig, well, why not just regular Dante? You know, the guy whose first 3 games were PlayStation exclusives? Okay, no? Alright, why not Snake, whose 3D career was mostly only playable on Sony hardware? I mean, Raiden's cool, but his game was the first modern Metal Gear in over a decade that was a multiplat, and just why, Big Daddy? Just why? It was so inconsistent. This is where my source comes in, because yes, there was a non-stop parade of conversations about these characters and many, many more. Superbot had a dream list that most fans would have flipped over, but for a multitude of reasons, they simply never worked out, and it wasn't for a lack of trying. The team pitched many characters from Sony's back catalog, and there were some that we started making but had to scrap when negotiations broke down. My understanding was that they were negotiating with the likes of Eidos and Activision for a long time. In Activision's case, the terms they wanted were simply too expensive. That big expensive character was, of course, Colton White from Crash Bandicoot, who for most of the life of the original PlayStation was pretty much its unofficial mascot. But yeah, Activision's ransom demand for the marsupial was simply too damn high. Spyro was also a consideration, but since the Skylanders franchise was at its apex, Spyro himself was being de-emphasized at the time, so yeah, that would be another no from Mr. Kotick. Now, when it came to Eidos, well, that was a bit trickier. They were in the middle of rebooting the Tomb Raider IP with a younger Lara Croft, but her new game wouldn't be out until March of 2013, so the timeline for them to include her just wasn't right. Of course, Eidos didn't want to confuse anybody by having the 90s version of Lara show up, despite her being another Sony icon, so then nobody gets Lara! Speaking of confusion, with the DMC reboot coming out, it was at Capcom's insistence that the new Dante be used instead of the old.
A million years.
Again, Superbot had to play with the cards they were dealt here. They wanted all the same characters that the fans did, but they were just always out of reach. But if there was one franchise that simply screamed PlayStation but was sadly absent, well, it was Final Fantasy. I know that negotiations with Square happened. My understanding was that because PlayStation All-Stars was a brand new team making a brand new game, there was skepticism from Square and likely many third parties on whether our team could properly represent their characters. Characters like Cloud are part of incredibly powerful brands, so companies aren't willing to hand them over to a young, unproven team. Now, remember, it took until Smash Bros.' third game and millions of copies sold for outside publishers to start clamoring for guest spots, so the likelihood of Superbot getting those sacred cows on their first go were incredibly slim. Also, in Square's case, the fact they had just put out a new entry in their own Dream Match series just a year before probably meant they wanted their characters to be played in their games. Hey, if you want to tussle with Cloud, then you buy Dissidia, or eBay an old copy of Guys. No, don't play that noise! Compounding matters was the fact that even though they were a first party set up by Sony, Superbot still had a fairly modest budget to play with. That, therefore, didn't leave a whole lot for everything else, because one issue most had with All-Stars was its actual content, or lack thereof. Case in point, the short, rather frugal ending cutscenes whenever you beat Polygon Man.
Doesn't matter. Swords and guns don't care, and neither do I. They're gone now. I'm still here.
As for the lack of single-player content, it was a scope/budget restriction. I could speculate that a lot of the budget went to licensing the characters in the game, but I don't know for sure. In terms of post-launch support, well, there were 2 DLC packs. The first adding Kat, Emmett Graves, and a Wipeout/Heavenly Sword stage, which arrived 3 months later in February of 2013. In all honesty, their DLC plan was really solid, as the characters themselves were free for the first 2 weeks, giving everyone a chance to try them without any risk. Now, while that February DLC release was good news, it was accompanied by way less good news. Well, it was just bad news. Sony announced they were cutting all ties with Superbot. This essentially made them an indie studio and forced them to then seek out a new publisher to support them in future titles. As to the reasons why Sony did this, well, when asked about the game's 3-month tally of over 1 million copies sold, then current Sony Interactive Entertainment president Shuhei Yoshida replied with, "It was not enough to have the momentum in terms of a business standpoint to continue to add characters or do a sequel." The source I spoke to puts forth multiple reasons. "I personally was working on DLC content for the game, but it got cut shortly after the vast majority of the 100+ team was laid off. I don't know exactly why they shut us down, but I can speculate that A, we were too expensive to operate, and B, they didn't feel that the business model was viable. I don't know the exact sales number, but I'm certain we eventually sold over 3 million copies on PS3. Maybe one more reason is that the PS4 was coming out soon and they didn't want to support a game on the previous hardware? Just speculation, unfortunately. The next and last DLC pack, Zeus and legendary Sony icon Isaac Clarke, was finished by Sony Santa Monica and was released the following month. Now, as to that planned DLC that was cancelled, well, it's been confirmed that the all-star lineup was going to be joined by Abe from Oddworld and Dart from Legend of Dragoon, continuing the long-standing tradition of Sony not caring about Legend of Dragoon.
No one knows what it's like to be the bad man.
Now, I wish this was the section where I tell you that despite the big bump in the road, that the studio lives on to this day, like, say, in our episodes about Sonic Boom or Disaster Day of Crisis. But no, Superbot's attempts to shack up with another publisher did not pan out, and in a super depressing final note, one of the projects they pitched but was ultimately rejected was a new title in Capcom's Rival School series. I'm literally putting through my own tongue in a calm but furious rage. They did manage to release Cuttlefish for mobile platforms a few months later before they shut down the following year, its employees being scattered to the winds once more. So while most people's immediate reaction to PS All-Stars is typically, that Smash clone, what a failure, well, it really wasn't. But what it was a case of poor timing. Being released right at the tail end of the generation and in between a lot of holding patterns for various franchises hurt the game's roster immensely, which is the main appeal of a crossover battle. There's really no telling where it could have gone if things had been different, if it had released later on in the PS4's life cycle, because then you'd easily see representation from Crash, Spyro, Horizon, there'd be Ellie, there's Jin, Bloodborne Hunter, probably Final Fantasy characters as well. Hell, fucking Spider-Man would be in it. Can you imagine that? That was a rough one. There was gonna be a new Rival Schools. Maybe, just... If you know of any other mismanaged multiverse misfires, just go to my Twitter, check out the Patreon. You can nominate the thing that you want me to do for the thing, and just see you next time, and thanks for watching.